Welcome to Bite Size Learning. I'm so excited to share our 12th video in a series inspired by Peter Liljedahl's Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics. Remember, you can access the previous videos on our webpage. Peter Liljedahl's book, Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics, has shifted the thinking of many educators in mathematics and beyond around how instructional norms in education have encouraged the creation of student behaviors that often interfere with student thinking and learning. Over 15 years of research, Liljedahl identified 14 factors where he, in essence, turned instructional norms on their head to see how student thinking would be impacted. He ultimately refined his research into what he calls optimal practices that promote thinking. And that is what these videos are about, how we can promote thinking across all curricular areas. Today, we're going to dig into what we choose to evaluate in a thinking classroom.
When you hear evaluate in a thinking classroom, you may think the focus of this video is going to be on grading curricular expectations. Well, it's not. Instead, we're going to explore the competencies that are valuable for students to be successful in a thinking classroom. So I invite you to pause the video and ponder for a moment. What competencies do you think are most valuable? Liljedahl's research found that regardless of geography, grade level, or professional development setting, educators always landed on the same three competencies every time. They are perseverance, willingness to take risks, and the ability to collaborate. Liljedahl asks his readers, is it our job as teachers to wait for students to come to us with these competencies in place? Or is it our job to develop these competencies with the students we have in front of us? Of course, it's our job to help students develop them. By using a thinking classroom model, we can build these skills. But if we really think they are important, we need to consider something else. We need to put our evaluation where our mouth is. We need to evaluate what we value. Just a brief note on the language used today. In this context, when we use the term evaluate, we mean how do we monitor and offer feedback as a means to support students in developing these competencies. We do not mean assign points or grades, nor include in the student's overall level of achievement on a report card, at least not in Ontario. Since we are in Ontario and Growing Success is our guiding document on assessment, evaluation, and reporting, some viewers may be wondering why we're suggesting evaluating something that may not be specifically articulated in Growing Success. Don't we have to stick to the expectations identified in Growing Success in our curriculum documents? Well, surprise, they are. You can find these three competencies in the learning skills section of Growing Success. Perseverance falls under the self-regulation skills. Willingness to take risks is part of initiative, and collaboration is a learning skill on its own. Additionally, supporting the development of these competencies are also important aspects of social-emotional learning. So how do we evaluate what we value in a thinking classroom? We need a tool that can evaluate these complex competencies. So what about a rubric? How effective are rubrics at communicating feedback to students? It turns out they're not. Despite how much time teachers spend highlighting or circling those rubrics, most students don't bother looking at or attending to the feedback they contain. Typical rubrics have little impact on student learning. Through his research, Liljedahl identified 5 ways to give our traditional rubrics a makeover. His first suggestion is to focus on student actions instead of student work, so that it becomes an observational rubric to be used while students are thinking. Then, reduce the number of columns to make the rubric more direct, digestible, and visual. On traditional 4-level rubrics, trying to differentiate between the 2 middle columns offers too much and too nuanced information to be useful to students. Replace the typical headings at the top of each column with an arrow to prevent students from internalizing the rubric as being an indication of who they are rather than where they are. Reduce the language in the middle column to prevent students from viewing the rubric as a series of discrete levels and instead seeing it as a continuum. And finally, reduce the number of competencies assessed to make the rubric more approachable and straightforward. In terms of creating the rubric, Lily Adahl suggests you co-construct the rubric with students when you notice a competency lacking in the classroom. Start by inviting students to create a T-chart with you, with indicators that show how that competency can be weak or how it can be strong. Then use that T-chart to create a rubric honoring the student language and terminology that was shared while co-constructing the T-chart. To implement using the rubric in your classroom, select only a small number of groups to pay attention to on a given day. As much as you value these competencies, you can't compromise your role as a teacher to be an evaluator. Also, even if you don't evaluate all students on the same day, noticing just 3 groups will impact the whole class. Not just because some groups will be evaluated, but because you are demonstrating that you value that competency. And at the end of collaborative work time, offer each group a rubric and invite them to self-evaluate by highlighting how well they demonstrated the competency while working together that day. So keep in mind that students see that we value something if we are willing to spend grades on it or if we are willing to spend time on it. So in summary, evaluate what you value. Co-construct T-charts with your students, then turn those T-charts into a rubric by assessing one competency at a time, using an arrow instead of labels, keeping the language brief, preserving student voice, and limiting it to 5 indicators. And if you're creating a rubric for a producible, be sure to use exemplars while doing that co-creation. Now I'll pass it to Jill.
In every curricular area, we can offer opportunities for students to develop the competencies we value. And in every classroom, we can offer feedback on these competencies. It is important that we show students we value these competencies by spending time and energy with them in every subject area. The competencies we value are skills that lead students to find success. These are things like the global competencies or the learning skills found in our curriculum documents. We can offer feedback on these verbally or with a rubric or in a conference. We can also offer opportunities for students to self-evaluate. While we still evaluate our curriculums, we must dedicate time to these competencies. We hope that you will take a moment to reflect. What competencies do you value? How will you evaluate them in your classroom? And one more question to ponder. What tool will you design or redesign to allow students to see themselves in the continuum of learning? If you try any of these strategies, please connect with us. You can follow us on Twitter, send us an email. We'd be very excited to hear from you. Thank you for joining us today. Next week, we will dig into using formative assessment in the thinking classroom.